Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sarah. I am Social Justice Officer for our Muslim Student Union, and I'm really happy and excited to welcome Edward Ahmed Mitchell today. And just a brief introduction. So Edward Ahmed Mitchell is an attorney and former journalist, and he currently serves as the Deputy Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, also known as Cair. If you haven't heard of Cair, Cair is the largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization in the US. And before this, Edward previously served as the Executive Director of Cair's Georgia chapter from 2016 to 2020. And before joining Cair Georgia, he practiced law as a criminal prosecutor for the city of Atlanta, and he worked as a freelance journalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But I'm just going to ask if you can turn your cameras on, we would really appreciate it. And now I'm just going to hand it over to him to talk about his career.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Begin with the name of Allah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So let me start by thanking Sarah and the Stanford University Muslim Student Association for hosting this event and for inviting me to join. Before the pandemic started, one of my favorite things to do after going to court was talking to students and visiting universities. And it was something I did quite often. I never turned down an opportunity to talk to young students, especially Muslim students. So I appreciate the invitation and happy to be with you. And before I give my spiel, I'll start by saying that when it comes time to ask questions, feel free to ask anything and everything about the work I do, career, advice, politics, whatever you'd like to ask about, feel free to ask. Even though this is being recorded, I will be honest with you, maybe not as frank as I might be, but I'll be honest with you and answer any questions I can, inshallah. So with that, what I'd like to do briefly is I'm going to tell you a bit about Cair and the work that we do. If you're not familiar with it, inshallah, I'm going to tell you a bit about how I got to this career as a civil rights attorney, what my background was, in the hope that that might inspire some of you and whatever it is you're thinking about doing as a career. Maybe you can take some lessons from my story. And inshallah, then I just want to talk to you about my view of where the American Muslim community stands based on what I've seen through my work as an attorney and an activist, and how I think you as young people coming up in the world can contribute positively to not only the American Muslim community and not only to the American community, but the world at large, inshallah. And I will try to do this in a short amount of time. I talk fast, and so that will, inshallah, leave plenty of time for you to ask questions, inshallah. So first, Cair. If you're not familiar with Cair, as Sarah noted, Cair is the nation's largest Muslim civil rights organization. What the NAACP does for African Americans, what La Raza does for Latino Americans, Cair does for American Muslims. Our main focus is countering anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Muslim discrimination. That is the main thing that we do. That is our main focus. Sometimes that's in the court of law, filing lawsuits and legal actions. Sometimes that's in the court of public opinion, using advocacy to advance positive change. But we don't just do that. We don't just fight the court battles and fight the media battles. We believe that countering anti-Muslim bigotry requires doing more. So we also spend a lot of time engaging in interfaith dialogue, educating the public about Islam. The theory being that education is a pretty good vaccine against discrimination. That is, it's hard to hate someone if you know a little bit about them. So in my time as the director of Cair Georgia, I can't tell you how many churches I visited, how many political groups I spoke to. I even spoke to the Tea Party, which was a really fun conversation. Lasted late into the night, had some very good questions and hostile questions, but that's okay. We want to get those questions. And that's very important, right? Again, to try to preempt the bigotry, preempt the discrimination from happening in the first place by educating people about their neighbors. We also try to make sure we're promoting justice, not just justice for Muslims, but for other people, right? That we as Muslims in America are not only concerned about ourselves, but also our neighbors. So whether that's addressing issues of police brutality or bigotry directed towards other groups like anti-Semitism, attacks on Sikhs, abuse of women. We try to make sure that we are, when possible, addressing those other causes, or at least supporting other people who are taking the lead on those causes. And so that's very important for us to do and for people to see Muslims backing them up. And then another thing that I think we spend a lot of time doing is empowering American Muslims to make sure that the next generation of Muslims in America has the skills they need to communicate their views and their faith well, to practice their faith without fear, and of course to get involved in politics or civic work or civil rights work. And so we have a great internship program for young people, and many of our chapters do around the country to make sure we are lifting up and empowering young people, inshallah. And so that is what we've been doing for the past 25 years. I mean, Cair was founded before the word Islamophobia was even widely known, before people recognized the need for Cair. But the need became obvious, very quickly. We had the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and obviously all of you are too young to have been alive when that happened, and I was just a kid when it happened. But initially, people assumed that Arabs or Muslims had attacked that federal building. It, of course, turned out to be a white far-right extremist, Timothy McVeigh. But Cair, that was like the first big thing Cair had to deal with at a national level, was defending Muslims from Islamophobia in the wake of the bombing attack. And they spent a lot of time dealing with discrimination cases, back at a time when it was considered strange for a Muslim woman to wear a hijab while pursuing a career and could easily face discrimination for that. So those first 10 years, Cair spent a lot of time dealing with employment discrimination cases, just trying to advance Muslim civil rights. And then after 9/11, obviously, as you may know, everything changed. I mean, I don't need to tell you what happened, but we all know how big of a problem anti-Muslim bigotry came at the local level, at the individual level, and at the federal level. Not only having to deal with people, your peers, engaging in bigotry or hate crimes or discrimination, but also the federal government itself engaging in bigotry. And so Cair really had to kick it into high gear after 9/11. We had chapters that spread around the country. Now we've got about 25 chapters around the United States. Some states have more than one chapter. We got California, Texas, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, all over the country to serve the Muslim communities in those states. And a lot of that growth happened in the wake of 9/11. And then you jump forward 10 years after the Iraq War and dealing with all of that discrimination and bigotry sparked by the conflict in those first 10 years. Then in 2010, you have Islamophobia actually get much worse because the Tea Party swept into political office in the 2010 elections. You had the huge fight over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in Manhattan. That was like a coming out party, a magnet for anti-Muslim hate groups to get organized and mobilized. And of course, President Obama's election spawned all these ridiculous conspiracy theories targeted him and the Muslim community. And so, after that, 2008 until the present, until about 2014, the Muslim community is trying to advance positive change politically, getting civically engaged more so. And then the rise of Donald Trump and ISIS, escalated things to a whole another level. And you all lived through that, so I don't need to recount that to you. But the point is, Cair for the past 27 years has been in this fight defending the rights of Muslims. Now, in my current position as the deputy director, I deal with management. I oversee our various departments. I'm not as hands-on in terms of the work we do. Alhamdulillah, before I did this, as the director of Cair Georgia, very different. I was very hands-on. I was acting both as a civil rights attorney, essentially one of our lead communicators. And when you work for Cair or any civil rights organization, life is kind of like almost like a television show. What I mean by that, if you ever watch like Law and Order or any sort of procedural television show where you've got the same cast of main characters every week, but something new comes in the door every episode, just some new thing that you don't expect. So when you're working for Cair, you really never know what you're gonna get coming in the door. One day you're dealing with a hate crime. The next day you're dealing with some sort of ridiculous discrimination case. The next day you're fighting the federal government's no-fly list, which has thousands of innocent Muslims on it, right? The next day you might be dealing with meeting with a congressman. I mean, I can tell you in my time with Cair, I have been in so many weird situations, sitting down with anti-Muslim bigots, attending protests, dealing with FBI agents. I mean, it's just been, you could say, a wild ride. And that is because the things that American Muslims confront, in our daily lives around the country, we confront a lot and we deal with a lot. And Cair's job is to be at the forefront, kind of the shield on behalf of the Muslim community when bad stuff happens. So we spent a lot of time firefighting, and that has, alhamdulillah, allowed us to do a lot of great work. It's also attracted a lot of attention. We are absolutely hated by anti-Muslim bigots and other far-right extremists. We get, as you might imagine, all sorts of threats and smears and attacks. And that's a good sign, in my opinion. For those of you who study the civil rights movement, the NAACP is beloved now, but back in the day it was accused of being an anti-American, communist, subversive organization. Same with Dr. Martin Luther King and others. So we take the hatred we get and hear as a positive sign that our work is having a positive effect. So that's a bit about Cair. Now next, how did I get into this career? How did I come to this point? And again, hopefully this will be helpful to some of you. So I was born in LA, Los Angeles, California. And growing up, my father is a Muslim. He converted to Islam in the early 80s before I was born. My mother was and remained a Christian. So growing up, I was exposed to both religions. And if someone asked me what I believed as a kid, forgive me for the background noise, my son is here and playing with our pots and pans. Anyway, so growing up, if anyone asked what I believed, I'd say, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't think Jesus is God. That was kind of how I thread the needle as a kid between these two religions I grew up exposed to. But as I grew up and I started studying religion by myself, away from my family, just quietly, I could not resist Islam. I did not want to be particularly religious, but it was the truth. Reading the Quran, I just couldn't ignore it. And I accepted Islam when I was about 17. Now, growing up career-wise, when I was a kid and all the way through high school, I actually wanted to be a filmmaker. I loved to write scripts and books. I would film movies at school and over the summer. I mean, I was really, really serious about it. And I was pretty good at it for a kid anyway. And if anyone asked what Edward wanted to be when he grew up, everyone knew he would be a filmmaker. But two things happened. Number one, the Florida recount between George Bush and Al Gore in 2000 made me interested in politics. And then less than a year later, 9/11 made me interested in international affairs. And then, of course, 3 years later, when I'm still in high school at the age of 17 or 18, I should say, I embrace Islam. And so obviously that, expands my horizons to really be concerned about, the world and what was happening at the time. And so I pretty quickly made a shift in my career goals to wanting to become a lawyer. And so by the time I was nearing the end of high school and going into college, I was already pretty intent on becoming a lawyer or a journalist. And everything I did was geared for either of those two tracks. So in high school, I was the editor of my school newspaper. In college, I was the editor of my college newspaper. Law school, the same thing. And then I worked as a reporter after law school. At the same time, all of the internships that I did, the extracurricular activities I did, were also geared towards law. So I was pursuing these two things to keep my options open so that I could make that final decision when the time came. So anyway, long story short, went to Morehouse College undergrad. I went to Georgetown University for law school. I graduated in 2012 from law school, and I began my career as a prosecutor. Now, as you might imagine, being an African-American man and a Muslim working as a prosecutor raises all sorts of interesting moral conundrums, right? And what's interesting about my work as a prosecutor is that I was a prosecutor in the city of Atlanta, which, as you know, is a black mecca, in America, led by African-Americans for decades. Most of the prosecutors at my office were African-Americans. And what that showed me is that, when the people who are doing that work have a genuinely different way of approaching the law, have a merciful way of approaching the law, who recognize when they're seeing someone come in the courtroom, they're recognizing someone who looks like them, who may have even gone through similar life experiences, it allows for a level of mercy and understanding that you may not see in all prosecuting offices. And so I saw a lot of positive things happen, to try to address crimes in Atlanta in a more positive way. I also at the same time saw the limits of what good intentioned people can do, because the system is what the system is. And you can throw however many good people you want at the system, but that doesn't completely overhaul the system, right? You're still working within the chains and the strictures of our criminal justice system, which is, as you know, flawed in so many ways. And so as much as I sometimes enjoyed the work that I did and thought it was beneficial, it was something that I did not want to do as a career and something I did not want to escalate doing, moving further and further up the ladder. So in 2015, right after Donald Trump called for a ban on Muslims coming to the United States, I got a phone call from Muslim community leaders here in Georgia asking me to consider leaving behind my job and becoming the director of Cair, Georgia. But at the time had no office, no staff, no employees, barely any money. And initially I pretty much said, no, I'm not doing that. But I thought about it and I prayed about it and eventually changed my mind, mashallah. And so I joined Cair in 2016. And as you know, in the past 4 years, it's been just an amazing time. I mean, we dealt with everything from Muhammad Ali passing away to Donald Trump getting elected to the Muslim ban to all sorts of other things, that happened over the past 5 years. So I tell you all that about how I got to that point, just so that you know that, there's always time to reconsider what you're doing. And one of the things that I found very beneficial in turning my career goal was internships and extracurricular activities. The internships really gave me an early exposure to the people who were doing the work, whether as journalists or lawyers. I got to see what it was like to do the work, and that helped, give me some inspiration about whether or not I really wanted to do that as a career. And then extracurricular activities are great, not only because it gives you a leg up, that early skill set you can start to build, whether as a writer, a lawyer, whatever it is you want to do, but also helps with your resume and helps you get indoors to get those internships, go to a school that's going to serve and cater to what you want to do. So those are the two things that I found very, very beneficial, was interning early, very early, in my youth, and also doing extracurricular activities whenever I got the chance to do it. And I'm sure many of you are doing that at Stanford. Now, the last thing I want to know before I turn over to your questions is this. Having been, someone who converted to Islam, essentially, in this era in which we live, having been someone who has worked as a reporter, as a lawyer, as a civil rights activist, all, while looking at the world through the lens of an African-American, a Muslim, and of course, a human being, I want to share this observation. And I've shared it many times. And I believe that for American Muslims, the most important thing that we must do in this country is not to get rich. It's not just to get great jobs. It is to advance positive change by harnessing the values and lessons of our faith. And I say a phrase over and over again. In America, I believe for American Muslims, faith without any activism whatsoever is deficient. And activism without any faith whatsoever is dangerous. And I say that for American Muslims in particular for this reason, that in this country, as Muslims, we have an opportunity that many Muslims around the world don't have, and that is to redress our government, to advance positive change, to protest, to vote, to meet with our legislators, right? To file lawsuits, when we see something wrong, we have some ability to change it in this country, right? If you're living in certain other countries as a Muslim, you may not have any option to change what your government is doing or what society is doing. You just got to be quiet, say your prayers, and go along to get along, right? That may be your situation for many Muslims around the world, from China to Myanmar to even certain European countries now. But in America, as Muslims, we have the right to speak up. And therefore, I dare say we have the moral obligation to speak up. We know what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said: if you can change evil with your hands, do it. If not, speak out against it with your tongue. If you can't do that, hate it in your hearts. And so for that reason, I say that for American Muslims, our faith in America, without any activism whatsoever, you're not voting, you're not donating to people engaged in activism, you're just trying to make money, keep your head down. May Allah accept from you and accept you from you and grant you paradise. But I think we should be doing more as Muslims in America. On the flip side, what I've noticed and what I say about American Muslims is that if we are engaged in activism, our faith must guide our activism. It must guide what we advocate for and how we advocate for it. We cannot take lessons from people whose values contradict our own. We cannot take lessons from people whose tactics and strategies violate the respectful tenets of our faith, right? And so as activists, what I say is that we as Muslims have to make sure that in whatever we do, whatever political position we take, whatever protests we attend, how we protest, that our faith, our deen is guiding what we say and how we say it. And my greatest fear for American Muslims is this: that we become successful in this country, become doctors and lawyers and politicians and movie makers and all this stuff. We become successful, but at the cost of our faith, that we sacrifice our faith to get ahead, that we get ahead without our faith, that we even sacrifice our faith for security, right? In the name of solidarity and getting people to love us and like us and be nice to us. And that's not what Islam is about, and that's not what American Muslims have ever been about, in my opinion. If you look at why we love Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Imam Deputy Muhammad and Linda Sarsour, it's because they speak what they view as the truth to power, even if it makes them incredibly unpopular. Islam began as something strange and will end as something strange, right? And so I experienced this in my own life, that sometimes there are things you feel like you got to say, and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to say it. I know this is the truth. I know I should say that. I'm just going to keep quiet. I don't want to rock the boat. And we've got to resist that. We've got to, like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X did before us, speak the truth. And that doesn't mean everyone's got to be an activist out there, with a picket sign. No, if you're going to be a doctor, that's great. Be a great doctor. You're going to be a dentist. That's great. Be a great dentist. You're going to be a teacher. Wonderful. Be a great teacher. You're going to be anything, an athlete, a janitor, whatever it is you're going to do. Alhamdulillah, may Allah accept it from you. That's great. But at the same time, make sure that your faith is inspiring and guiding what you do in your personal life, your professional life, and especially if you're an activist. That is incredibly important, to have your faith centering you and guiding you in what you say and what you do, what you advocate for, and how you advocate for it. And as the Deputy Director of Cair, one of the things I love about our organization is not only our diversity, that we look like the United Nations, Black, white, Arab, Latino, Asian, not only that we're religiously diverse. We got Muslims who work for Cair. We have a Jewish director of Philadelphia, Mormons, Christians, secular humanists. Not only that we are geographically diverse all around the country, but what I love about working for Cair is we are a faith-based civil rights organization. We strive to harness our faith to advance civil rights, right? And I think that's something that we don't always get right. We are imperfect people, and therefore in our behavior, and therefore our organizations are imperfect, but that's our goal. That's our North Star, inshallah. And so, I'm very proud and happy to be a member of this organization. And then for the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet. Lawyers, we always say the last thing I'll say and they keep going, but I'm really serious. Now I'm going to be quiet after this, inshallah. Is that, for you all, especially at Stanford, I mean, you guys and girls, excuse me, gentlemen and ladies are, really the promise of our community. Even if we right now in our generation, my generation, win what we're fighting for, that's great. But we've got to make sure our next generation is empowered to continue advancing change. Your parents and my parents, they either were Muslims who immigrated here often, or they were Muslim converted to Islam and they built mosques and they, got good jobs and they allowed you to go to school. They did their job, alhamdulillah. And then my generation, right, we were fighting to protect what the older generation built, right, to protect it and advance it. And then you all, will inshallah grow up in an environment where you don't have to worry about building mosques. You got plenty of mosques already, right? You don't have to worry about fighting for your right to wear a hijab or grow a beard. We've got that right for you. We've won that right for you. That's written in the law, alhamdulillah. Now you've really got a chance to play the game, really to go out on the field that is America and advance some positive change, not play defense, or play some positive offense. And however way you want to do that, whatever way you see fit. So, alhamdulillah, I'm glad to see we got so many Muslims, in our universities, and so many Muslims on this call. It's a good sign, and I'm very happy to speak with you all tonight. And with that, I'll be quiet and turn it over to you for any questions. And again, anything you want to ask about career, Cair, politics, touchy things, whatever you want to ask about, feel free. Bismillah.
I can start with a question, and maybe we can do raising your hand if you have a question, and then one of the hosts can call on you or just drop it in the chat. But my first question is, in your opinion, what do you think is the biggest issue facing Muslim Americans today, whether it's an internal one or an external one?
So that's a tough question, but a good question. I mean, if you think of the biggest issue, I've told you, kind of philosophically what I think is the biggest threat to Muslim Americans, which is that we win our rights and we lose our faith, and we lose our values. That's kind of the big philosophical threat that I'm seeing in my work. But if you want to talk about like what's a policy issue, like what's a kind of a concrete issue that we're confronting, I think racism is, as we've seen over the past year, is a huge issue that our country is confronting, and the Muslim community is not immune to that issue. And so I've been heartened by the fact that over the past year, many Muslim organizations have really stepped up their game to not only speak out about issues of racism impacting African Americans, but also calling out racism within our own communities, our own misogyny, our own families, and trying to really tackle that issue. And at Cair, we've also been working to address that issue internally to make sure we're advancing and upholding racial equality, not only outside our organization, but inside the organization. I think that's very important, that our community tackle that issue of racism and remind people that, you know, as Muslims, we have never had a theological issue with racism. What I mean by that is there's never been a time in Muslim history where a racist could cite Islam to justify their racism, right? Other religions, not all, but have had that problem, right? I know as an African-American that the Confederates and segregationists would misinterpret the Bible and quote the Bible to try to argue that Black people were inferior and that therefore they had to be segregated and enslaved. You know, misinterpretation, misquoting, all that, but they had some theological argument they tried to make. In our religion, Islam has always been very clear, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam made it very clear in his last sermon. No difference between a white and a black, red and a black, et cetera, et cetera. We're all equal. The only difference is our taqwa, our piety, and only Allah knows what that is. And so we have the values, we've got the teachings, we just need to practice it, not only as individuals, not only in our families and our communities, but also in our houses of worship and our organizations. Now, and I'll cheat and I'll add one more issue that I think is very important, and that is the issue of global Islamophobia. I think we as American Muslims have somewhat gotten over the hump in dealing with Islamophobia. There was a real threat when Donald Trump took office that, you know, not only would you have had the Muslim ban that came into play, but a much worse Muslim ban, that you would have seen Muslim organizations being shut down, which is happening in France right now, you know, Muslims being deported in mass. And none of that came to pass in the most extreme way that it could have happened. So I believe that we have, inshallah, gotten over the hump of Islamophobia posing like a mortal threat to the Muslim community. It still poses a threat. I mean, hate crimes are still out there. Discrimination is still out there. All of that is real. But I think we've moved past the point of being concerned that, you know, Muslims will not be able to live their lives in this country. Inshallah, I think we're past that. But all around the world, what we're seeing is the Islamophobia, the anti-Muslim bigotry that Muslims have been confronting over the past 20 years in America has gone global. In France, you know, the supposed beacon of freedom and liberty, you know, the French government has given an utter lie to that claim. They are shutting down Muslim organizations, banning Muslim kids from attending private school, forcing Muslims to violate their religion if they go to school, especially young girls, arresting Muslim women if they go to a beach wearing burkinis, if they wear a niqab in public, and at the same time fining people if they don't wear a face mask, which shows you the idiocy of the French government's policies. And I say that frankly. And then you go to other countries. I mean, you've got countries that are banning halal and kosher meat. You've got countries that are requiring Muslims to say they will not engage in what is called political Islam. You go to China, we've got 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps being raped, being banned from praying, forced to eat pork. Myanmar, where you got ethnic cleansing. All this is global Islamophobia, right? And the problem that we're seeing is that Muslim governments, you know, we've got this patchwork of Muslim countries, Muslim governments. There's no united Muslim front. There's obviously no caliph. There's no, you know, single Muslim power like the EU has to speak up for Muslims. And Muslim governments, economically weak, politically divided, are not speaking up against global Islamophobia. And therefore, it falls to Muslim civic society organizations to confront global Islamophobia, whether that's Muslim American organizations, European Muslim organizations. We have got to and are working to try to band together to confront global Islamophobia, to expose it, speak out against it, organize economic pressure on corporations to pull out of countries that are engaging in this bigotry, organize pressure on governments to make sure they live up to their values, their claimed values if they have those values, or start upholding good values if they don't have those values. And so right now, I think that's a big project for us, is exposing and identifying global Islamophobia. And one of the things we're thinking about doing this year is launching an academic Islamophobia index that will really, in a quantitative way, measure Islamophobia in various countries around the world. So we expose the problem. Then we bring Muslims around the world together to figure out what we can do about the problem. And then, third step, we apply that political and economic pressure to try to resolve the problem. And our neighbors in the Jewish community have had great success in doing this. So we've got to take some lessons from them and how they tackle global anti-Semitism, which still exists. It still festers, right? But it's not a mortal threat to the entire Jewish community, right? You don't see Jewish people being locked in concentration camps by European countries anymore, alhamdulillah, right? And so we as Muslims have to get to a point globally where Muslims are not in that sort of widespread mortal danger anymore, like we're seeing in China or Myanmar and other places. So that's another big issue that we've got to tackle. And then I see, okay, a question here in the chat, which I'll read and then try to address, inshallah. What are some concrete things we can do in the workplace to overcome the stereotyping of Muslims? In particular, because we are not a homogenous group, we are from so many countries and a variation of practice, so there is no singular image that can represent us. Well, you know, that's a very interesting question. So in the workplace, you know, as a lawyer, my main concern is not necessarily stereotyping, but rather to make sure that Muslims are able to, number one, get jobs without being discriminated against, right? Just like we have studies showing that if you apply for a job and your resume has what's considered a stereotypically Black name, you're much less likely to call back. If you are a woman, you know, pursuing a certain career, you know, you may be less likely to call back. And the same thing is true of people with Muslim names. So number one, to make sure that Muslims are able to compete for jobs at an equal level, right? Number two, that when a Muslim has a job, right, they are able to practice their faith just the way everyone else is able to do that. So if you want to grow a beard, that's your right. You want to wear a hijab, that's your right. You need 5 minutes to pray, dhuhr, that's your right. You need to take off a little time on Friday for Jummah, that is your right. So to make sure that Muslims are able to practice their faith in the workplace. Number three, to make sure that Muslims are represented in all careers that are positive. Not every single career, because every career is not a positive, morally acceptable thing, but to make sure Muslims are represented in as many places as we can be, not only to advance positive change, but to let people see what Muslims are like. One of the things I always do when I'm explaining Islam to our neighbors, before I talk about what Muslims believe or what Muslims practice, the first thing I do is talk about who Muslims are, because almost every audience has the stereotype that your average Muslim is an Arab, speaks Arabic, doesn't speak much English, you know, is very, very, very strict and rigid and unmerciful. These are the stereotypes, and all come from one region of the world. None of which is true, right? Only 20 to 28% of Muslims are actually Arab or from the Middle East, North Africa, right? Most of the people who convert to Islam in America are not men, but women. American Muslims are incredibly diverse. We're almost evenly divided between Arab Americans, Black Americans, Pakistani and Indian Americans, and then smaller minorities of white Americans and Latino Americans and others. And so what we try to do in our work is make sure we're highlighting the diversity of the Muslim community. That doesn't mean you're not going to experience stereotyping and certain expectations in the workplace, but every time you, as a Muslim, are not hiding your faith, not hiding your values, then people get a chance to see, you know, that, oh yeah, that person who I got to know and like, and they do a great job, oh, they're Muslim. Awesome. And you want to get to a point where people don't think of you any differently, or if they think of you differently, it's because they're impressed, that they develop in their mind an association between being a Muslim and being excellent, right? That we have a religious obligation to do our jobs well, and therefore we excel in our jobs. You know, I have no problem with positive stereotyping, right? There are many positive stereotypes about many communities, right? You know, the Asian American community, the Jewish community, many positive stereotypes, right? And that can be problematic. But at the end of the day, I'd much rather the Muslim community be saddled with positive stereotypes than negative ones. So if anyone sees you doing a great job, whatever that is you're doing, whether it's being a doctor, lawyer, janitor, whatever it is, that's good for you, it's good for the ummah, it's good for the community, and will help break down stereotypes about Muslims, and especially Muslims who are engaging in public-facing activism or politics. That's also a great opportunity to show the diversity of our community religiously, politically. By the way, not all Muslims, you know, have one standard political view. In fact, most Muslims used to vote Republican 20 years ago. Now most obviously vote Democrat, but our political views are still very diverse. You have Muslims who are, you know, foreign policy liberal, socially conservative, and then you got the opposite. And so, you know, anytime we're out there doing our work, people get to see the diversity of our community, while also seeing that there is some uniformity in our basic values as Muslims. Sarah, looks like we got some more questions here. Do you want me to read them out, Sarah, or do you want to pick?
So you can read them out. So,
okay.
Or if you want me to read them out, either way.
Sure, go ahead, Yusuf. You can read them out.
Okay. So some of the questions in the chat, and then so just a quick statement for everyone. If you have questions, you can feel free to send them in the chat, and then either myself or Sarah will read them out. Or I think we can still do the hand raising if you'd like to say your question out loud. But the last question we have in the chat is from Umara. How has activism changed in the last decade? What have been some good changes and what have been some bad changes?
Yeah, so briefly, I'll say that I think one of the big changes is that, especially when I think of the Muslim community, is that once President, when the Ground Zero Mosque incident happened back in 2010, that's, exactly 11 years ago almost, I think that rallied anti-Muslim hate groups together. That was their coming out party to go from the dark recesses of the internet to the public. But it also was an opportunity for people to recognize that when Muslims said Islamophobia was a real problem, people started to take it seriously. And that was when you started to see non-Muslim organizations really making an effort to reach out to and work with Muslim organizations, right? To recognize that the Islamophobia that had been festering for 10 years after 9/11 and often being ignored or even enabled by so-called liberal politicians and liberal groups, that in 2010 was really a trigger for groups to start working together to counter Islamophobia. And then the rise of Donald Trump, I think really triggered various organizations, Latino organizations, Muslim organizations, Jewish organizations, et cetera, women's rights groups to really say, we've got to band together, right? We can't be in silos trying to defend ourselves by ourselves. We've got to work together to get through this time in our history. And I spoke at the Women's March, the first one that we had back in 2017, and we had thousands of people there in Atlanta. And the analogy I used was this. I said, I looked out at the crowd and I knew we had people very diverse crowd, people who had different political views, social views, people I probably disagreed with about a lot of issues. But I said to them, look, when there's a madman coming to destroy your village, you don't really have time to debate how to run the village. You've got to unite, defend the village, defeat the madman, and then you can go back to debating how to run the village. And so I think over the past 10 years, you really saw the communities that were under threat, the activists representing various communities under threat saying, we've got to band together. Whatever issue differences we might have, even if we might be focused on completely different issues, we've got to support each other, back each other up. So that means, yes, I might be attending your protest about Kashmir. I need you to attend my Black Lives Matter protest. I might be attending your protest about immigration abuses at the border. I need you to attend my protest about police brutality, right? That we're backing each other up, we're supporting each other. And I think that was a big change that I saw, especially around the Muslim community, to see Muslims really stepping up and making sure they had other people's backs, and also people stepping up and saying, we've got your back as a Muslim community. Now, one of the things that I think that we still run into is the issue of, people willing to support Muslims and work with Muslims up to a point, right? There are some things where we still run into resistance. I'll give you an example. There's a very prominent liberal group in Georgia. I'm not going to put them on blast, but they've been very supportive of the Muslim community when it came to the Muslim ban, things like that. And when Donald Trump announced one of his crazy policies on Palestine, we announced we were going to have a protest about that. In this group, the leader said, okay, we're going to be there. We're happy to support you. This is wrong. And then about, I think the day before the day of the event, we got an alert from them saying, look, we can't be at this event. We can't do this Palestine protest. We got to pull out. And it was because of pressure from within their organization. People call themselves liberal and progressive saying, we'll help you with the Muslim ban, but we can't speak out about human rights abuses against the Palestinian people, right? That's where they drew the line, right? And so we still run into that. People being willing to support Muslims as long as it doesn't inconvenience them, right? Happy to use Muslims as window dressing, but not when it actually means potentially sacrificing something yourself to stand with another community. So I think that's a big change we've seen in activism, is that willingness to support each other, work with each other, and to not be territorial, right? But to be able to support and to be the second chair, right? To be the third chair backing up someone else with them in the lead, because they're the experts. They know what they're doing, and you're there to support them. So that's a positive change I've seen in recent years.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Every response so far has been very eloquent. There's another question in the chat, and then after that one, Laura, I see your hands raised, so we'll take it to you. But the question in the chat is, how can we empower and make an impact through OIC?
Yeah. So I assume this question is about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation dealing with the issue of global Islamophobia. Correct me if you meant something else. So there is a coalition of Muslim groups in the United States, the United States Council of Muslim Organizations. We did hold a press conference and put out some public pressure on the OIC, calling on them to speak up about human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims. The problem with the OIC is that, obviously it is a collection of governments, a collection of countries. And even though the OIC has done some positive things in trying to unite Muslims as best we can, you know, it still is a voluntary organization. It has no authority over its member states, really. And so there's a limit to what it can do. And it's not going to go further than what the governments who are part of it are willing to do. And so if you've got, you know, the leading major political and economic powers in the OIC unwilling to speak up about China, either because they're afraid or because they just don't care, right? Some governments, you know, really have economic dependence on China. And so they really feel like they can't speak out without harming their own people. But there are other Muslim governments that just don't give a darn. They don't care about Uyghur Muslims, and they even actually endorse what China is doing to Uyghur Muslims. And so when you've got those two groups of people, governments that are politically divided, politically unrepresentative, and economically weak, who aren't willing to speak up, and then you got other Muslim governments that just don't care about Uyghur Muslims and only care about, you know, their own leaders, then you end up in a situation where it's very hard to convince a coalition to say anything meaningful, right? And the OIC can speak up because they speak up about Myanmar and Rohingya Muslims, right? Because Myanmar is not some economic or political powerhouse, you know, that's going to interfere with their business relationships. So they're willing to speak up about that, but you don't see them willing to speak up about China. And so it's going to take continued public pressure. And it's going to take, I mean, in the long term, if Muslim countries had representative governments, I don't mean you got to have like a full-blown, you know, democracy where everyone's voting on every issue, right? But some sort of constitutional governments where you had shura councils that were representative or legislatures that were representative. If governments were answerable to their people, then I have no doubt, inshallah, that you'd see governments more willing to speak up about what's happening around the world to Muslims. Because you have governments that are unrepresentative, it's very easy not to care, right? Because you don't have to answer to anyone except yourself. And so, you know, a long-term thing that I think we as Muslims have to advocate for is for governments around the world in Muslim majority countries to become more representative. I'm not saying you've got to, you know, abolish your current form of government, but at least, and I believe this is Islamic, to have at least a shura, right? To have shura that represents the people that you take counsel from to guide your policies and your leadership, and you don't have some absolute dictatorship that can do whatever it wants, regardless of how immoral it is, and regardless of what the people think of it.
Thank you so much. That was another excellent answer. Lara, if you want to unmute and say your question, and then after that, there's another question in the chat, inshallah.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. So considering the insurrection on January 6th at the Capitol, I think it's been very evident that Trump's hateful rhetoric really resonates with his supporters. So I'm just curious, do you think his influence on his supporters may continue to embolden them to make their Islamophobia explicit under Biden's presidency as a form of like retaliation? If so, has Cair prepared to do anything to support Muslims under Biden's presidency?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the short answer is yes, that's something I was concerned about. I mean, my fear was that if he lost, because here's the thing, if you're, you know, let's say you're a bigot, right? Or you're a hate group, and, you know, someone who shares your hatred is the president of the United States, then you feel like, okay, I've got a champion in the White House. I don't need to take matters into my own hands. He's banning Muslims. He's doing this and that. He's saying what I think. So I don't need to risk going to jail to burn down the mosque next door. I'll just wait for Donald Trump to shut it down, right? You don't feel like you've got to take actions into your own hands. That's not to say that hate crimes didn't occur under Trump. They did. There were still people who took matters in their own hands, felt emboldened to attack people. You saw the shooting at that mall in El Paso targeting Hispanic Americans and immigrants. You still saw attacks on mosques. So it still happened, right? But my concern is that once he was gone, that his supporters would feel like they don't have a champion anymore, and they would feel like we've got to take matters into their own hands. Now, my prediction, my fear was correct. The thing I didn't expect is that his supporters aren't really focused on Muslims anymore. They're focused on attacking the federal government. Donald Trump has directed all of their anger and their frustration towards Republican and Democratic elected officials. So on, you know, January 6th, you saw them targeting not mosques, right? Not Latino immigrants, but they were going after the government itself, which is a threat that we faced in the 1990s when you had far-right extremist groups targeting the federal government. So that's the one thing I did not expect, is that because of the way Donald Trump left, that so much of the anger that these hate groups have would be directed not at Muslims or Latinos, but at the federal government. Now, that does not mean that we're not at risk anymore. That risk is still there. And so one of the things Cair is working on right now is updating our mosque community safety guidance to the community, because once the pandemic passes, inshallah, people start going back to the masajid, we got to make sure that mosques are taking their security seriously, make sure that they are not caught with their, I was about to say, use a metaphor that's not appropriate for television, but not caught unawares, not caught unprepared. And so we're actually working right now with a security expert to update that guidance to the community. And that's one of the things that at Cair, Georgia, we spent a lot of time doing, was going to different masajid and giving actually a self-defense seminar that was created by a police officer who also served as a member of one of our Cair chapters, who developed a really great presentation dealing with how to keep your mosque, the building, safe, how to respond if you come under attack, active shooter response, how you as an individual, if you're a Muslim woman who gets targeted, how you can use basic self-defense measures to keep safe. And then, of course, how to make sure that you are preempting all this stuff by making sure that you're thinking ahead and stopping this stuff from happening in the first place. So yeah, that's something that we are working on and that communities have to be cognizant of, is the potential that these right-wing extremists who now don't have a champion will start targeting Muslims. But we don't want to live in fear. We got to carry on. We don't want to be walking around with our, looking over our shoulders or anything, but we tie our camel, right? Just tie your camel, make dua, and then carry on, inshallah.
Thank you so much again. So we have a couple more questions in the chat, and this one's really interesting. They ask, in light of the murder of George Floyd, there's been an increase in public opinion about using violence to further political means. Additionally, San Francisco State had invited hijacker Layla Khalid to speak on behalf of Muslim activism. And I'll also just add a quick note. One thing that's interesting about that event is a Jewish group known as End Jewish Hatred actually lobbied to Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube to basically have that event canceled, and it never happened. But the person's question is, what do you think about using violent means to advance Muslim activism? Yeah.
So, what we've seen, in recent years is not an issue with Muslim activists being violent, but rather with, you've seen far-right extremists, engage violence when they don't get what they want. You've also seen, some far left activists engaging in violence as well during protests. I mean, one of the things I've said to my white liberal friends is, you're going to show up at a Black Lives Matter protest, you got to follow our lead, right? You can't come with your own agenda and start blowing stuff up and setting things on fire. That's not what we're here for. And you're interrupting the process and disrupting our message, right? So you got to get with the program. So we've seen varying degrees of violence, by activists on both sides. Far more dangerous violence, far more widespread violence on the far right and the far left, obviously. So that's the first thing I would note. Now, the second thing is that in terms of Muslim activism, right? If you look at, the Muslim extremists, Muslim terrorist groups, right, who have engaged in violence, you don't see any of these people. If you look at their life stories, their histories, you don't see a moment in time. I mean, this is almost a universal truth where they were engaging. They tried peaceful political activism before, going to extremism and violence, right? What you usually see with these people is either a jump from not caring about Muslim activism at all to suddenly just deciding to become extremists. Or you see, and this is very common, we saw this in Europe with a lot of the attacks that were perpetrated in the past few years, people who were actually completely irreligious, not observant Muslims. I mean, you saw people who were thieves, had criminal records, prostitutes, drinking alcohol, all this crazy stuff in their personal lives. And they almost went from one extreme of irreligiosity to religious extremism. So I say that to say that you don't, in my opinion, in my observation, see some sort of issue of Muslim activists kind of debating, should we use peaceful means or violent means? No, if you see Muslims engaging in activism, they're just engaging in activism, right? There's no kind of, in my perspective, conflict or debate going on there. Now, overseas, in places where Muslims are under violent threat, that might be more of an issue. For example, in Syria, the protests against Bashar al-Assad started off as peaceful protests, right? He decided to respond with overwhelming violence, and the people decided, well, we're not going to just get shot down and killed, and you had soldiers defect, and an armed resistance took hold, right? In China, where you've got Muslims who are being raped and banned from practicing their faith and all that, and that obviously feeds extremism. It leads people to think, well, I can't speak up. I can't be an activist. I'll go to jail. I can't even use Twitter, I'll go to jail. And so that leads, you put people in a corner, you know, in other countries where they feel like I've got to engage in armed resistance. And that's very dangerous and destructive, right? And we've seen the chaos and horror that can show. And so, you know, we as Muslim activists, this is why it's so important that we as Muslim Americans who have this ability to engage in free speech, that we make use of it, right? To try to advance positive change, because we've got the ability to do that peacefully. It was, I think, Kennedy or someone else who said that those who make, what's the quote? Peaceful change impossible make violent revolution inevitable. That was the quote. I may be misquoting, right? So that's a real concern we have with global Islamophobia, is that if Muslims are being massacred and murdered by their governments overseas, you're putting them in a corner where you're going to create or embolden extremist groups. And the last thing I'd say about this is that, you know, we as Muslims, you know, we know that our faith teaches us that you cannot engage in violence to advance political change. You're all willy-nilly, right? You can't, as a Muslim, go and just say, I'm going to form a militant organization and take matters into my own hands, right? One of the fundamental teachings about conflict in Islam is that, number one, war can only be launched or declared by the legitimate Muslim leader, right? Can't just be some, you know, individual running around doing what they want to do. It has to be a legitimate, just like Congress can only declare war in the United States, at least that was the case for many years until we gave the executive far too much power. Same thing, right? And so for me, I think there is absolutely, and should be absolutely no debate among Muslim activists about whether or not, you know, here or abroad, well, especially here, I should say, about the issue of peaceful versus militant activism, because as our religion teaches us, you obey the laws of the land in which you live as long as they don't require you to violate your faith, and you can't go off willy-nilly engaging in physical conflict without, you know, permission from the legitimate leader. So I don't think that is a debate that's happening and should happen. Now, overseas, obviously, when Muslims are under violent threat, you know, under occupation and being killed and massacred, you know, that's a completely different situation where people might have, you know, a different situation they have to confront, and a legitimate leader they might have, you know, to you know, decide how best to defend the community from imminent violent harm.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. The last question we have in the chat is, do you feel Muslims have fair representation in the Biden administration?
So President Biden, when he was candidate Biden, said very specifically that he would include Muslims at every level of the administration. That means, to my mind, the cabinet. But there are no Muslims in the cabinet. Not a single secretary is in the cabinet. This despite the fact that Islam is the third largest religion in the United States, and by 2050 will be the second largest religion in the United States, inshallah. You know, the Christian community is well represented in Biden's cabinet. The Jewish community is well represented in Biden's cabinet. There is not a single, not one, Muslim. And by the way, it could have been a Muslim who's a medical professional, you know, working on COVID-19 issues. Could have been a Muslim working on, so we have Muslim experts in all these different fields, but you don't see a single cabinet member. So that promise has not come to pass. Now, we do, however, see Muslims in other staff positions that I think are positive. We got a prominent Muslim in the National Economic Council, got a Muslim working in the White House in a legislative position as, I think, a legislative affairs director. We've got a Muslim working for the Civil Rights Department and Homeland Security. We got Muslims working at DOJ, the Justice Department. So we do see some Muslims showing up in staff positions, but we need to see more Muslims in leadership positions because, as Elizabeth Warren likes to say, personnel is policy, right? The policies will, the personnel you have will, you know, reflect and determine what kind of policies you're implementing. So if Muslims are not at the table at all, good chance we're going to be on the menu. By the way, one caveat I'll say to this: I do not believe that Muslims, Americans, should pursue every single career or even every government office there is, right? Because some government offices might require you to do something wrong, right? If you have a certain job in the Treasury Department, your job might involve, as an example, interest-based loans or usury, right? Which is forbidden in our faith and forbidden for all people universally by God. So you don't want to get involved in that, right? You might be working in, I don't know, DOJ, you know, at a time when you have a president who wants to uphold the death penalty. So you might be charged with, you know, writing a brief in support of the execution of someone, even though there's a good chance they didn't do it, or they were unfairly given that sentence compared to someone else. So, you know, we want to avoid as Muslims being put in situations where we have to violate our values. So we should pursue career advancement. We should pursue all sorts of positions to advance positive change. but at the same time, not just be pursuing representation just for the sake of representation, just for the sake of having a job, but rather jobs where we can make meaningful change without contradicting our values. And so we need to see more of that in the Biden administration, more representation in positive positions.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So I know we are running a little bit close to the end of the hour. There's no questions currently queued. So actually, if you don't mind, if you still have some time, I have a question.
Sure.
And this is one like that's personal to what our MSU is trying to do right now in our work. But sort of one of the goals that we've talked about this year for the Social Justice Committee is to share more issues that are involving American politics that Muslims might not be aware of and that they should be. I think there's a lot of Muslims that are very consciously aware about issues that directly affect them, but things that might tangentially affect them, they aren't as cognizant about. And one example that comes to mind is, you know, we had the whole ordeal with the Muslim ban, and there was this huge call to action and this cause by the Muslim community and supporters to go against that. But, you know, tangentially related is just the broader immigration sort of debate, whether it be regards to immigration from Mexico and other Central and South American countries. And so I guess my question is, how do we, you know, have increased Muslim engagement in issues that on the surface might not be directly involving them, but are tangentially involving them?
Yeah. So look, I think as an MSU, you've got a great opportunity to be teaming up with other organizations that are taking the lead on those issues, right? And holding joint events, right? Having shared spaces to, number one, learn from each other, like a mutual learning about these different issues, and then seeing what you can do to advocate for these issues together. And that can be a really positive training ground for you as students in college for what you're going to be dealing with in real life. And so I think it's a great opportunity you have if you see an issue, whether that's immigration, right? Because bigotry and immigration did not start with Donald Trump. It didn't end with Donald Trump, right? You know, there were people being deported in mass under the Obama administration, right? Including people who committed no serious crime and have been here for years. So, you know, I think, you know, in looking at work with Latino groups and immigrants' rights groups, I think you have a great opportunity to team up and make sure the Muslim community is aware of these issues and fighting for those issues as well. Same thing with the Black Student Union, issues relating to police brutality or systemic racism. Great opportunity there. And then I think also when it comes to women's rights, whether it's the Me Too movement or equal pay for equal work, I mean, great opportunity to team up there and to highlight the fact that Muslim women leaders do amazing work in our community and around the world. Great to let people see that, because that breaks down the stereotype that dudes are running everything in the Muslim community. Not true. And so, you know, those are great opportunities for things to team up on. Now, again, the one caution I say is that I don't believe in solidarity with everyone for the sake of solidarity, right? You can't team up with someone who is pursuing a cause that blatantly contradicts the values of your faith. Now, you may have one issue you agree on, and you can team up to work on that issue together. But we also got to be very careful when we engage in group solidarity, joint solidarity, that we, again, our faith is guiding us and limiting what we're doing and what kind of partnerships we're having and what those partnerships are geared toward. So those are just three issues. I mean, women's issues, women's rights, police brutality, racism, systemic racism, and obviously immigrant rights, Latino rights. I think those are three easy things that the Muslim community needs to be engaged on, and you all can be doing that at the local level within your school. And college really is, in my opinion, a training ground for real life. I mean, you're around people who are different than you, got all these extracurricular activities, you can engage in activism, you're fighting with the administration about things they're doing you may not like. It's really a great training ground for real life. So definitely hope you all make good use of it while you can, inshallah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Sarah, I'll defer to you now. I think we're about to wrap up.
Yeah, we're a little bit over time, but I just wanted everyone to join me in thanking Edward Ahmed Mitchell and talking to us today, and sharing your perspective and advice.
Yeah,
So
thank you for having me.
For coming.
And I'll note for anyone who wants to be a lawyer or is pursuing that career, if that's the case, I'm sorry. No, I'm joking. That's a good thing. Inshallah, I'm going to put my email in the chat. So feel free to reach out to me if you ever want to pursue an internship or a job or just need some advice about, the law or journalism, either one, inshallah. Feel free to reach out to me, inshallah. Emails in the chat. It's e-mitchell@cair.com, e-mitchell at cair.com, and it's in the chat. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much. I'll also just ask real quick in regards to that, if they have any questions just about policy or other ways to be involved separate from, you know, career stuff, is that also okay for people to contact you?
Of course. Yeah, inshallah, please. Always love talking to our young people, inshallah. I'm still young, by the way. I'm 34. So I still consider myself young, mashallah. So, but you know what I mean.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.